Yeah.
Okay. So I decided to study reaction time and teenage driving. As responsibilities and commitments increase among teenagers, sleep has become a second priority to many high school students trying to balance all of their responsibilities and manage their time. The advent of cell phones, combined with social and cultural pressures, have been pushing teenage bedtimes back for years. Dr. Claire McCarthy for Harvard Medical School's health publishing website says that this downward sleep trend among teenagers has been steady for over 20 years, with older teenagers, in other words, the ones that are old enough to drive, getting less sleep than the younger teens. The grades, extracurricular activities, and community involvement required to be a competitive college applicant often create time management issues among overscheduled teens, with their daily sleep suffering the consequences. In an article published by Stanford Medicine, sleep deprivation among teenagers is even referred to as an epidemic. According to research from a 2018 study conducted by the American Academy of Pediatrics, 73% of high school students are failing to get between 8 to 10 hours of sleep each night, which is the recommended amount for teenagers of high school age. Chronic sleep deprivation results in accumulated sleep debt, which can exacerbate the feeling of exhaustion significantly, as well as its effects. Sleep deprivation can cause slower reaction times, affect alertness and attention, as well as judgment, decision-making, and coordination, all of which are important in driving. In many places, teenagers rely on driving to get where they need to go each day, whether it's school, practice, volunteering, or another activity. This begs the question of how this sleep deprivation epidemic affects teenagers' safety and the safety of other drivers on the road. Studies have shown that drivers with slower reaction times to both road conditions and emergency situations cause more traffic accidents than other drivers. Sleep deprivation and accumulated sleep debt are national issues among teenagers, and with insufficient sleep causing slower reaction times and drowsy teens behind the wheel, accidents are far more likely to occur. In researching ways to test how the amount of sleep teenagers get each night affects their competency behind the wheel, the issue of how to quantify this result came up. Dr. Michael Howell, a sleep medicine physician and neurologist at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, recommended reaction time as a common and effective test to determine driving ability and competency. This method would yield quantifiable results that would allow for a data analysis and a solid conclusion to be reached. The question then became, how does the daily amount of sleep affect reaction time when driving in licensed Minnesota teenagers of high school age? An experimental setup was developed in order to test the hypothesis that there is a correlation between the amount of sleep teenagers get each night and their reaction time when driving. First, willing participants for a study had to be found. A survey was sent out to the 11th and 12th grade population at one Minnesota high school asking how many hours of sleep the student gets on average each night, whether or not they were licensed drivers, and if they would be willing to participate in a study regarding their sleep habits. 198 responses were received from this survey. This chart shows the breakdown of respondents who were licensed. As you can see, there's a pretty even distribution among those who responded yes and no. This chart shows the respondents willing to participate in the study with a pretty even distribution between those who said yes and no, and a small number of people who requested more information. This third chart shows the average nightly amount of sleep that the respondents got. As you can see, there are people in every category, with the majority in the column that gets between 7 to 9 hours of sleep each night, which was surprising to me in and of itself. Of the students who indicated that they were interested in participating, 12 students were selected at random from those who indicated that they got 7 or more hours of sleep each night, making up the control group. Similarly, 12 students were selected at random from those who indicated that they got less than 7 hours of sleep per night, making up the experimental group. 10 students from the control group ended up participating, and 9 students from the experimental group ended up participating, with 19 subjects tested overall. In order to measure the reaction time of the participants when driving, a device that measured reaction time needed to be created. Though an online reaction time app could have sufficed, I found that a device that more accurately measured the reaction time when driving was ideal. So in cooperation with an engineering student, a device was created in order to do just this. As you can see in the diagram, this device measures reaction time by simulating the interior of a car. It consists of a large button on a raised platform placed on the floor, which simulates the pedal of a car. This button is connected to a mainframe sitting on a table above the button, containing a small light and a computer device that measures and displays the time between the light turning on and the button being pressed, or the reaction time. This number was displayed in seconds to the hundredth place, or 2 decimals on the screen. The clear panel on the main box simulates a windshield. The light on the inside of the box, right behind the clear panel, is used to simulate an emergency situation on the road that requires a quick response from the driver. I triggered the button to turn on at random times, simulating the randomness and suddenness of emergency situations. The entire device was powered by a portable charger as shown in the picture. The subject sat in a chair with their right foot flat on the floor to the right of the button at the beginning of each trial. The 19 subjects were each tested 3 separate times in 1 week, with the simulation taking place on different days, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. The experiment consisted of asking the participants for their year in school and the amount of sleep they got the night before in hours, which I then recorded, and then explained the process for the reaction time test, and the test was performed. 3 trials were done each day to ensure accuracy and precision, with the results being reported immediately after each trial. After each trial, the subject would be asked to reset to the starting position with their foot immediately to the right of the raise button. The average reaction time was calculated for each day. During the experimental trials, all raw data was collected and organized in a spreadsheet as seen here. You can see the grade in school of the participant, the daily hours of sleep, reaction time for 3 trials each day, and average reaction time for each day. Upon initial review of the data, it was clear that many of the subjects were getting the same few numbers each time, but a statistical analysis of the data needed to be conducted in order to reach any conclusions about the accuracy of the hypothesis. After consulting with an AP statistics teacher, I concluded that the best way to analyze the data to determine the accuracy of the hypothesis was to use a chi-square association test, which is used to determine if there's any association between 2 variables. In this case, sleep and average reaction time for each separate day the trials were conducted. The initial hypothesis, based on background research, was that the 2 variables were associated, so the amount of sleep high school students of driving age get each night is correlated with their reaction time to driving. In order to perform the chi-square test for association, the raw data needed to be reorganized into a table with 2 variables separated into categories and compared to each other. You can see in this table up here, with sleep categories in columns and reaction time in rows. The numbers in the center indicate how many subjects had that combination of sleep and reaction time. This table was made into a matrix on my calculator so that the chi-square test could be done to find the p-value. The p-value is basically the probability of obtaining results at least as extreme as the observed results. This value is used to validate a hypothesis against observed data, so the smaller the p-value is, the greater the statistical significance. However, in order to determine whether the p-value can be considered relatively small or not, it must be compared to an alpha value. A researcher can never be 100% certain of the outcome of a study, so the alpha value, which is chosen by the researcher, basically represents how much a researcher is willing to be wrong. In this case, I was willing to be 90% sure of the outcome of the study, making the alpha value 10% or 0.1. The p-value that was calculated from the chi-square test for the table was about 0.22, which is greater than the alpha value of 0.1 that I chose. Because the p-value from the table was greater than the alpha value chosen, there is no significant evidence for the claim that reaction time from driving and sleep are associated. Despite efforts taken to minimize the limitations of the methodology and experimental design, the ideal driving simulation could not realistically be created, given the circumstances and environment, to yield the most accurate results. The limitations may have affected the conclusion, and most likely they did. One of the limitations of the experimental design involves the prior awareness participants had. In the experiment, the process was explained to participants prior to beginning the experimental process to make sure they understood what was expected of them. When driving, situations that require a prompt reaction time in order to avoid any serious consequences often happen quickly and without warning. In a real driving situation, drivers would also have to assess the situation they are faced with to determine the proper response, whether it be braking, swerving, etc. These variables make an accurate simulation very difficult to create. Study participants were instructed to hit the button as soon as they saw the light turn on, therefore taking away the complexity of a real-life situation involving the mental processing of the situation and determining the proper response. Another limitation of the experimental setup is the device used to measure the reaction time itself. Because it was constructed by an engineering student in a high school engineering lab with limited time and resources, there were naturally limitations on the accuracy and quality of the device and its measurements. The numbers displayed for the reaction time only went out to the hundredths place, or 2 decimals, meaning that the numbers between participants may have varied more than what appeared on the screen and was then reported in the data. If there had been more decimal places shown on the display, the data would have been more precise and accurate and potentially could have shown more variation between participants' results, which would have made the analysis more accurate. A wider range of participants in terms of hours of sleep could also make the results more accurate. A larger research population with a wider range of sleep would have led to more accurate data because the results would not be based solely on the few extreme cases that were present in this study. Because the amount of sleep recorded was based solely on participants' recollection of the amount of sleep they got, there was a lot of room for error in this part of the methodology. Having participants use a sleep tracking device to ensure the sleep amount was accurate would have increased the precision of the results. And because the trials were done each day, 3 times each day, for each participant, reaction times may have become faster with practice, rather than because of the amount of sleep the participant got the night before. Among teenagers, sleep deprivation is impacting performance and well-being in many areas of life, with slower reaction times when driving simply one of many negative consequences on a very long list. Already chronically sleep-deprived teenagers continue to get increasingly fewer hours as many demands, obligations, and commitments take precedence over sleep, which in their minds can be sacrificed. Because many people find themselves in a car at some point almost every day, it can be easy to forget the dangers that are also associated with driving. With distractions already prevalent when behind the wheel, sleep deprivation adds an extra layer of risk to what is for many a daily necessity, especially inexperienced teenagers. Though previous studies and research showed that the correlation exists, the results of this study demonstrated that there was no significant evidence for the claim that daily hours of sleep affect reaction time in high school students when driving. Though the evidence generated through this research method did not support the hypothesis, the results illustrate how it can be very difficult to determine a conclusion with all of the variables unaccounted for in the design. A simulation designed and created by high school students with limited resources, operating on a narrow time frame, cannot adequately take into account the numerous variables that affect driving ability and reaction time in teenagers. However, this project gave good basis for further research. I now know what I would change or add in the future to make this more thorough investigation. While the results from this study did not support the hypothesis or align with the background research done, it is still crucial that further research is done investigating the effects of daily sleep on reaction time. Further research utilizing more advanced equipment that is better suited to account for the many variables in a more controlled environment would provide a more thorough understanding of the correlation between teenagers' sleep and reaction time when driving. Understanding the correlation is critical for Minnesota high school students who often sacrifice sufficient sleep for success in other aspects of their lives. Encouraging teenagers to prioritize sleep is not only essential for their overall health and well-being, but it can also save lives on the road.
Some questions. How did your review of the methods used by scholars in the field inform your selection of a research method that aligned with your research question?
Most of the methods that I found that were used by scholars mainly involved high-tech projects with larger budgets. So Dr. Howell, actually, who I talked to at the University of Minnesota, helped me come up with a method, reaction time, that was simplified but still effective. And so I went a little further with it than what he recommended, which was just an app. And I had a device built that simulated the interior of a car as best I could.
Okay. How do your findings provide directions for future research?
This gave a good jumping off point for further research about reaction time and driving. I would use what I learned about limitations to design better processes for future testing. I know what I would add and what is missing and what could be improved. There are lots to improve on, and I mentioned a lot of those in my actual presentation.
Okay, thank you. How did you handle the uncertainty of the research process?
I went into this knowing that I would definitely have some hiccups. So I was definitely right about those hiccups. But I was basically mentally prepared to handle the problems as they came up while still keeping my end goal in mind. And I knew that I would be learning whether it succeeded or not.
Okay, thank you.